Good day, grade 12 learners, and welcome to today's English Home Language Paper 2 lesson. My name is Belinda Retief, and this lesson is brought to you by the Gauteng Department of Education in collaboration with the Sibono Discovery Centre. And thank you, as always, to our partners for helping us to present these lessons. I hope grade 12s that the exams have gone well for you so far. I know that you've been busy for a long time and you're probably quite tired, and I've heard some of the children saying they're very much over it by now. And I just want you this afternoon during this lesson just to take a little bit of a breath, relax a little bit if you can, work with me, listen along, and I'm going to make it as easy and as accessible for you as I possibly can. At this stage in the exams, you need to be brave and you need to make your strong shoulders and just push through until the end. Remember that you've been at school now for at least 12 years. Many of you would have started school even before grade 1. You would have been in grade R and grade R. So you really are feeling like your time at school should be coming to an end. But I really want to encourage you in these last 2 weeks and the last 3 weeks of exams just to keep your focus where it needs to be. Please don't give up. Please don't become lazy and think to yourself that you just don't have any more energy. This really is your opportunity to show everything that you've learned at school in the past 12 and 13 and 14 years. And so this is the time to really just finish off as strongly as you can. To give you some tips and some insights into answering the poems, and then I'm going to touch very briefly on your drama and your novel and just give you a few generic tips for the drama and the novel. I think at this stage, with the exam being tomorrow morning, I'm hoping that you've done quite a bit of preparation already. But if you still feel like you need preparation and there are things that you haven't done, may I please suggest that for the novel and the drama, you find the summaries that have been provided to you at school. I'm quite sure that all of you have got summaries that were provided at school. I wouldn't encourage you to find a summary off the internet at this stage because we don't always know if that source is particularly reliable, and sometimes those summaries are written for different students that are writing different exams from what you're writing, whereas what your teacher has provided for you is far more likely to be specific to the needs of the NSC paper. But my advice for Life of Pi and Dorian Gray, depending on which one you'll be writing on tomorrow, and then also for Hamlet or Othello or The Crucible, my advice at this stage is make sure you've read through a good summary 3 or 4 times so that you're quite familiar with your characters and the plot and the themes and how the characters do things throughout the novel of the play that indicate and expand on the theme and the point that the writer is trying to make. That is really the most effective thing that you can do now in terms of section B and section C. So we're going to be looking at paper 2, literature. I'm going to spend a little time talking about common errors and common misconceptions, the kind of mistakes that we often see learners falling into. And I'm very well aware that when you're writing the paper, you are under pressure and you're feeling pressurized. And so sometimes when we feel like that and you've been under pressure for a few weeks, sometimes we do make careless errors and errors that could rather be avoided. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to focus particularly on the rubric for the poetry mini essay, and I'm going to talk about diction, tone, and imagery in particular, again in reference to the poetry mini essay, and then some questions and answers generally on poetry, and a few moments also on the unseen poem, which I hope is going to be very useful to you. So remember, the paper is divided into 3 sections. You've got section A, poetry, and there, question 1 will always be the poetry mini essay, and then questions 2, 3, and 4 are your poetry contextual questions. So each question will give you the poem and a set of questions for 10 marks each, and then of course the unseen poem, which is question 5, and that is compulsory. All of this information is also contained in the paper. I'm sure you've practiced it during your June exam, and I'm sure you practiced it in the prelim exam, and your teachers have reminded you, but the paper will tell you exactly how many questions to answer and where the choices are to be made. So you just have to concentrate on reading the instructions. But in total, you will then answer 3 poems for a total of 30 marks. Then section B will be the novel, either The Picture of Dorian Gray or Life of Pi. And for the novel, you get 2 questions, an essay question and a contextual question, of which you must answer 1. My advice to you always is that you read every single question. So when you get to Life of Pi, you read the essay question and you read the contextual question. You read the passages that they've given you, and then you decide which question you're going to answer. And you will do this in connection with section C for the drama. So often what happens is even your teacher at school might have advised you which essay to write, or when you're outside the exam with your friends and you're all talking nervously about the exam, you might make a sort of a pact and say, okay, guys, we're going to do the Hamlet essay, all right. And you sort of all make an agreement to do that because it helps you to feel like you've got a plan. But I really don't recommend that, grade 12, because we've got no idea ahead of time what the question is going to look like. And it's very possible that the Life of Pi essay or the Dorian Gray essay feels much more accessible to you, and you just know that the question they're asking is something that you are able to answer. Then you must, in that moment, be able to make the decision to write the novel, the essay on the novel, and then you will do the contextual on the play. And you do get 10 minutes of reading time, and during that time, that's when you read your contextual questions, and that's when you decide how you're going to choose. It can make a big difference to the outcome of your paper. And then also remember that in the paper you are going to see questions on novels and plays that you have not studied. It's perfectly fine as long as you answer on the novel that you studied and the drama that you studied. We only expect you to answer on 2. The others you completely ignore. They are for other candidates that have studied different novels and different plays. So just make sure that you write on the novel that you studied at school and the drama that you studied at school. And then remember, if you do, for example, the essay on Hamlet, then you must do the contextual question on Dorian Gray or Life of Pi. But I think you're probably quite confident with that by now. So let's have a look, if we go further on, at the paper. Remember, it's an 80-mark paper, and you have 2.5 hours. And over and above those 2.5 hours, you get the 10 minutes of reading time. They do say this in the paper, but remember, we suggest that you spend approximately 40 minutes on the poetry, and that leaves you approximately 55 minutes each for section B and section C. And in terms of your literary essay, that gives you enough time to write quite a good plan, to spend at least 10 minutes thoroughly planning your literary essay, making little notes, denoting for yourself exactly what each paragraph will be about, and then you've still got 45 minutes to put the whole essay together. Remember that we don't expect you to write a plan plus a rough draft plus a final version. Many learners like to do that. It makes them feel secure. If you feel you've got the time, you may do that, but you're not going to lose any marks if you simply do a plan and a final. And that is what I recommend. I recommend that you spend a good 10 minutes making a thorough plan, thinking about everything that you want to say, going back to the question repeatedly. And once you've got a good plan, you put that into a final version. And what you can do once you've written the final version is you can read back over it, and should you want to make a few small changes, that's an excellent time to do it. I find that that gives learners enough time and enough opportunity to perform well in the literary essay. And then we move on to the common errors and misconceptions. So this advice that I'm telling you about now is actually being written for you by the chief examiners and the internal moderators who work with the literature papers year after year. So this advice doesn't only come from me, it comes from people that are very, very experienced in the marking and the setting of paper 2. So what we often see is that candidates do not engage with the texts on a figurative level or present a critical discussion when required to do so. So very often with poetry in particular, there will be figurative language, and we're going to get to that in a minute. But you will know when we talk about poetry, your teachers told you, here's a metaphor. That is an example of alliteration. This is what the simile is talking about. So we really want you with the poetry and the contextual question to come to grips with those literary devices and to be able to see how they're working and present a critical discussion. So very often we're going to ask you to critically discuss. And to critically discuss means that you have really thought. You're giving an opinion based on facts and on thinking and on comparing different facts with each other. So when we say a critical discussion, we don't simply mean that you must criticize somebody. Critical thinking means the kind of thinking where we take various facts into consideration and then we base our opinion on that. So a very simple example of what would be critical thinking would be, for example, if we had to talk about what certain people earn. So if we had to talk about what nurses earn, I think in our society, many of us will be aware of the fact that we often hear it in the news that nurses are not very well paid, especially if you consider that it's a very, very difficult, demanding job, long hours on your feet, a lot of emotional demands, and perhaps a salary that doesn't really match the kind of effort that goes in. So if we had to do a critical discussion on what nurses earned, we can't just say nurses don't earn enough. It's not fair. We've got to give a reason why. So we've got to bring a few facts. So we've got to go and do a little bit of research, and we've got to say, for example, nurses are paid, the average nurse with maybe 2 years of experience is paid, for argument's sake, 100 Rand an hour. And then you would have to go and compare that to what other people earn, and then you would say, you maybe go and research what waiters earn, and then you'd say the average waiter, if they get a basic salary from the restaurant and they get tips, they can earn up to 300 Rand an hour. Now I've got two sets of facts. I'm saying nurses are earning 100 Rand, waiters are earning 300 Rand. Now I give my critical discussion. Now I say, in my opinion, that's very unfair or that's not right. If you consider, that nursing makes a difference to the quality of somebody's life and can sometimes make a difference between whether the people live or die. And to pay 100 Rand an hour for that doesn't seem right if you consider what you might earn waiting on tables. Okay, so these facts I've just made up. I don't know if they're true, but you will find those facts from what you studied in your novel or your play, or, from what you're interpreting in the poem. So you've got to give the facts and then say what you think. And that's what a critical discussion means. What we sometimes see as well in the literature paper is that candidates don't really read the question very carefully. They simply go to the poem or the contextual extract and they just rewrite excerpts of the poem or sections of the contextual extract. And they use this as an attempt to answer to the question. You will not be credited for that. The marker has got, a specific question in front of them, and there is a memorandum and a marking guideline, and they're looking for more than that from you. They want you to engage with the question, so please do not do that. Also, what we find commonly is that candidates don't respond to the specific requirements of a question. So what I was talking about earlier about the critical discussion, we will find learners will talk a lot about the poem and they'll talk about the simile, but they won't give the critical discussion, or they won't mention all the aspects of a question. So for example, in the Hamlet essay, if they ask you to discuss manipulation and deception as themes throughout the play and to identify 3 characters who use manipulation and deception, then you must in your answer talk about 3 characters. So what we would often see is a learner would focus the whole essay just on Hamlet, and they might talk a little bit about Claudius, and then they run out of time, and maybe they didn't plan carefully, and then they won't mention a 3rd character at all. So now you must imagine your marker has got a marking guideline where credit must be given for content on 3 different characters. So if you focused mainly on one character, very slightly on a 2nd character, and not at all on a 3rd character, you will understand now that we cannot allocate all the marks to your discussion of the one character. So that's what we're saying about specific requirements of a question. And very often you'll get your paper back once the teacher has marked it, and you'll be quite disappointed because you'll think, I really wrote a lot and I knew a lot about that. But if we break down what the question was really asking, then you'll start to understand that there were some things that you ignored. And in the marking guideline, they will demand that you address every part of the question. So that's why we say, please, when you're reading through your questions, highlight and circle and underline the key areas and keep going back to the question. Read the question, answer it, and when you've written your answer, go back and look at the question again and ask yourself, did I meet those requirements? And add on then if you have to. And very often in the 4th place here, what we also find is that candidates do not explain the effect of a technical aspect on a poem. So in the poetry, they're always going to ask you to comment on, for example, the diction and why is the diction effective. Or they'll say, discuss the metaphor, or discuss the simile, or discuss the figurative language. And you need to be able to say why that aspect of poetry is effective here. And I'm going to do some examples of this with you. So we'll talk about that in a moment. When you get your poems, and the minute you get your paper and they say to you that you may start reading, for those 10 minutes. Please look at every single poem and every single question. They're going to give you 4 poetry questions. For question 1, for the scene poems, they're going to give you 4 scene poems, and you have to answer only 2. Please don't choose simply the poems that you think you liked better. You have to look at the questions, because a slightly more difficult poem might actually have more accessible questions, whereas a poem that you thought was very easy and you really liked it and you think you understood it, maybe the questions are really tricky or really difficult. So you must base your decision on what the questions are and where you think you can answer best. And they give you the poem, grade 12, so that you can keep referring to it. It's really a wonderful resource, that poem there. Everything that you need to know about that poem is there in the poet's own writing. Everything that they're asking you about is right there. So if you use the poem well enough and keep reading it, you should be able to do very, very well on the poetry question. So once you've decided which 2 poems you're going to answer, then you're going to start answering, referring to your poem, and you'll always see in the literature paper, you'll have the poem and the questions will be directly underneath. So you should never really be in a situation where you have to keep paging over between the poem and the questions, and that is for your convenience that they do that. Always in your literature paper, use good English, formal English, and a formal style. The very best, the very smartest, the most correct English that you can imagine, you must use in your literature paper. And this includes simple things like capital letters, proper punctuation, full stops, and paragraphing. All of those things help to form an impression of your work, and your marker will very quickly form an impression about whether your work is careful and whether you've thought about what you're doing, or whether you're just messing around and writing any old thing on the paper. You have to show your marker that you've worked and that you've tried and that you are serious about answering this paper, if indeed you are serious. So even things like the use of the apostrophe. If the word is supposed to have an apostrophe, use it. Your marker will see that, and throughout the paper, that good use of language forms a better impression and is very likely to then result in a better mark. The mark allocation for each question is vital, grade 12s. If it's a 2-mark question, you need to write in the region of 2 to 4 lines for your answer. And I'm going to do some specific examples with you. But if you've got a 2-mark question and you are writing 6 or 8 or 10 lines, you run the risk of not answering the question specifically enough, and you run the risk, the very real risk, of not being able to finish the paper. So it really is a challenge to hit that sweet spot where you say enough for the mark allocation, but not too much, and then it leads you to missing out on the opportunity to make marks elsewhere. So you must look at your mark allocation, underline it or highlight it as you're working along, and make sure that what you give is enough. The 3-mark questions are a little more demanding. There will be a number of 3-mark questions in your paper. So for 3 marks, we're now looking at a 4 to 6 line answer. If you are answering specifically enough, you should be able to do it in 4 or 5 lines if you identify exactly what is being asked. Don't rattle on for half a page. You are wasting your time and you're wasting the marker's time. You need to be able to move on. All right, let's have a look at the rubric for your poetry mini essay. I'm sure you've seen this before. This is how the poetry mini essay gets marked. they allocate 6 marks to content and 4 marks to structure and language. And this is why we strongly recommend that you consider writing the poetry mini essay, because you can do very, very well. There's really a big possibility that you can get a mark like 7 or 8 or even 10 out of 10 on the poetry mini essay, because the content only counts for 6, and then your language and structure, these things that we've been talking about, the structure of your paragraph, your use of sentences, how well you use your language, how well you've put your argument together, that is worth 4 marks. And that, if you just take your time and you think and you do an effective plan, you will be able to do that grade 12s. You are at that age and you've had enough practice to be able to structure an essay in such a way that you get a good mark for it. And then in terms of the content, they will be looking at, have you interpreted the topic, which is what I've talked about? Are you in fact answering the question? And you will know that if you read the question a few times, and while you're making the plan for your essay, you keep reminding yourself what they're asking. And then they're going to look at the depth of your argument and whether you've grasped the text. And I'm quite sure that all of you have been beautifully taught throughout this year, and you've had time now to read over all of your poems, and you know what the poems are about. So you can grasp the text, and therefore you can do well. I wanted to look at some examples of past questions for the poetry mini essay in order to show you the kinds of questions that come up again and again and again. So in tomorrow's paper, we are expecting a question that looks very much like one of these questions. And so we can already be prepared for the kind of thing that they might be asking us. So in last year's paper, at the end of the year, they asked Sonnet 130 as the essay question, and they said, and you'll know this about Sonnet 130, it's a very popular poem. Lots of learners have really enjoyed this poem. The speaker mocks the manner in which women are presented in traditional love poetry. So they're going to give you a statement, and that there is the statement that they've given for this poem. The speaker mocks the manner in which women are presented in traditional love poetry, and then they give you the question, discuss the extent to which you agree with the statement with close reference to imagery, tone, and structure. So they give you a statement, then they say, do you agree or do you disagree? And then they give you even more help, and they say, base your discussion on imagery, tone, and structure. So now if we go back to the rubric, do you see that your content is worth 6, but they have given you 3 things to focus on? They've given you imagery, they've given you tone, and they've given you structure. In other words, if you create a little bit of content around each of these, you can get the full 6 marks. So the mark is not going to specifically be looking for exactly 2 points on imagery or exactly 2 points on tone. But if you can do at least a little discussion, a paragraph of 4 or 5 lines on each of these, you will be meeting the requirements of the rubric for the full 6 marks. You say something about imagery, something about tone, something about structure. You remember to link what you're saying to the question, which in this case was the, mocking the traditional love poetry. And then you see how you can get your 10 marks. That's why we say the poetry mini essay can be very effective. Let's compare this to a question that came from one of this year's June exams about at a funeral. Here it says, Again, you get a statement. The poem vividly portrays anguish, deprivation, and untapped potential. So here they're helping you even further. They're giving you 3 things to talk about. They say, talk about anguish, talk about deprivation, talk about untapped potential. Again, the question is the same. Discuss the extent to which you agree with the statement with close reference to diction, tone, and imagery. So here they've asked slightly different things. They've said diction, they said tone, and they've said imagery. But you see how they've focused on 3 poetic techniques. So again, if you can write a short paragraph in which you specifically refer to each of those, you will create enough to meet the demands of the rubric and you'll do well. And remember, like I said about the poetry, that the poem is there. So even if you look at it at the beginning and you're a little uncertain, you can go to the poem and you can look for those things in the poem because you've got the whole poem next to you, and you write on your poem and you make marks and notes for yourself, and you use all of that to fulfill the demands of the rubric. If we look at an example of another question from The Morning Sun is Shining, here the question says, here's your statement, the simplicity of the poem hides a deeper meaning. So if we're analyzing the question, we've got to talk about simplicity and we've got to talk about a deeper meaning. So those are 2 things we have to focus on, and they've said discuss this statement with close reference to diction, style, and tone. So for diction, we must talk about simplicity and a deeper meaning. For style, we must talk about simplicity and a deeper meaning. And for tone, again, very easy. Talk about simplicity and a deeper meaning. And then you will fulfill the requirements of the rubric. And that's why we're saying any learner that just answers carefully, that reads the question, can do well on the poetry mini essay. And every single poetry mini essay will say your response should take the form of a well-constructed essay of 250 to 300 words. That's always going to be the requirement. That's in our exam guideline. So we know that that is exactly what the examiner is going to do. So you're only going to write about a page. If you've got very big writing, you'll maybe write a page and a half. It's not very difficult. So you can really do that. And we're going to talk about, ways in which you can fulfill that requirement as we go on. And then remember that you need to know what these various poetic devices are. So I've broken it up here for you. These are the 4 most common ones that they ask. But we've also seen them ask different things. They've asked about punctuation before, for example. So just look in the question which 3 poetic devices they ask you about tomorrow, and you will focus on those 3. But let's talk generally. So often they'll talk about imagery. All right, and imagery is basically everything in the poem that is used in order to appeal to your senses. So in imagery, the poet will use words, and he'll use comparisons, or she will use comparisons and all these different techniques around word to create a picture in your mind, or to create an image, as it were, in your head. Can you see what the poet is talking about? If you think about it, can you visualize it? And there'll be a combination of literal and figurative language. And the figurative language will include, for example, has the poet used metaphors, similes, personification, alliteration, assonance, onomatopoeia? And all of these things are the things that were taught to you during the year. And as you've been studying your poetry and looking over your poetry notes, you've seen where your teacher has said, this is the metaphor. Oh, there's an example of assonance, or there's an example of alliteration. And all of these aspects and devices help create the image, the picture in your mind. So if they ask about imagery, go to the poem and find an example of a metaphor or a simile or alliteration or anything that you see, and then look at how that poetic device can be linked up to the question once again. So find an example of imagery, because remember, we only have to talk about imagery for a short paragraph. Find one example of imagery and show how this example can be linked back to the question. And remember, we said imagery is simile, metaphor, assonance, alliteration, personification, any of those poetic devices. And I'm sure, grade 12s, that at this stage in your school life and your school career, you can look at a poem and find me at least one or two examples of imagery. I've got every trust and every belief in your capability at this stage. You definitely are able to do that. Diction, we always talk about diction. I'm sure you'll remember that they asked you a question on diction in your language paper, paper 1. We know that they love to ask about diction. So it's very likely that in tomorrow's paper, either in the poetry or section B and C, or both, or all three, you're going to get a question on diction. And remember, we always say, where do we find words? If I wanted to find all the words, where would I look? I would look in a dictionary. So diction means words. Which words does the poet choose? And why does the poet choose those words? Okay, the poet creates mood and atmosphere in the poem by using words. And if they ask you to talk about diction, give the specific word. All right, so in the poem, just don't say, oh, the diction is emotional, or the diction shows us that the poet is feeling emotions. Give me an example of the word. Say the poet uses the word oh with an exclamation mark. This shows that the poet is feeling particularly emotional in this situation. So with diction, give an example of the word and then say why this word is contributing to the meaning and meeting the demands of the question, whatever the question asked about. So diction is simply the choice of words. And you've usually got, with diction, what's nice is there are quite a few possibilities. It's never going to be only one word that is somehow creating all of these effects. It's usually a lot of words used together that are creating an effect. So if you can identify one or two, then you've answered the question. You've met the demands of the rubric. You're doing well. They like to ask you sometimes about the style that the poet uses, the style of writing. So remember, in language, style is just the same as it is in fashion. So in order to create a style in fashion, you don't just create your style with the shoes that you wear, or just create your style with how you might cut your hair or color your hair or braid your hair. There are lots of different elements. So it's what you do with your hair, whether or not you choose to use makeup, the jewelry that you might wear or not wear. What kind of clothes are you wearing? Are they high fashion? Are they chosen for comfort? You know, are you going to a matric ball or are you going to a sports practice? That will determine what you're going to wear. And all of those elements put together make up your style, your fashion style. And it's the same with the writer. So everything that the writer does with language, you know, what does the writer do with punctuation? What does the writer do with sentence length? How is the poem formatted? Is it a long poem without any stanzas? Are there lots of short stanzas? Are there blank spaces in between the words? Is the language formal or informal? Are there lots of capital letters? Are there no capital letters? All of these little aspects make up the style of the writer. And so you must look in the poem for punctuation, sentence length. What does the poem look like on the page? So remember, if that's your page, sometimes, the poem will be very formally written, and that will be the poem. It will be a long poem, and there might be 4 little stanzas, each with a little break in between, very structured, very formal, a very particular message. Whereas other times the poet might write a long line and then a short line. Then he'll leave a gap over there, then he'll write 3 lines there. Then he might write 4 little words all by themselves. And then, it just depends on the mood that the poet is trying to create and on all these different aspects. That will determine the style of the writer. And always look for formal and informal language, because that's going to tell you a lot. Another one that they love to ask is tone. So remember that tone tells us how the writer feels about this topic that he or she is talking about. The writer might be happy, or the writer might be angry, or sad, or outraged. What is the writer's tone? So with poetry, there's always going to be emotion involved. When you're looking at the poems, you need to know that there's some kind of emotion here that is being expressed, and your job is to find out what is that emotion, to identify, why did the poet write this poem? What emotion is the poet trying to convey to me? And it might be that the poet is amused, or it might be that the poet feels bitter, or the poet feels angry, or the poet feels cheerful. What I want to say to you here with tone is just make sure that you use very strong words. Don't simply tell me the poet is sad. To me, that's not strong enough to really reflect the depth of what a poet is doing. Sad might be, or, like maybe you left your favorite jacket somewhere, and you can't remember where you left it. You were at your friend's house, you were at your father's house, and then you went to the mall, and somewhere between all of that, you've lost your jacket. Now you might be a bit sad, okay, but I'm not sure if you're going to be outraged. I don't know if you're going to be passionately angry, or absolutely devastated. So do you see what I'm saying? Is that there's different kinds of emotions for different situations. So don't use weak words to describe what the poet is feeling. Find the confidence to use those very, very strong words. And it's likely that with the kind of poems that they've chosen for you in matric, it's likely that the emotions are going to be particularly strong. So if we think of, the Ingrid Jonker poem, To the Child Who Was Shot Dead, she's not sad, about what happened there. It's much more than sad. She's devastated. She's angry. She's bitter. She's feeling resentful of the police, the government, everybody that's got any kind of power in the country that is allowing these things to happen. It's extremely strong reaction that's being reflected to you in the poem. So don't just say, oh, she didn't like it much. No, that's not enough. You need to have the confidence to say what's really, really happening. So I thought what we'll do now is we'll have a look at a couple of poems and 1 or 2 examples of the kinds of questions that we expect to see in tomorrow's paper. And you'll even see, if you've gone through past papers, that very often the questions between the 3 different contextual poems will be quite similar. So we expect to see similar questions, even though the poem itself might be a different poem. But let's have a look at this one. It's the Olive Schreiner, The Morning Sun is Shining. So if we talk here a little bit about the style of the writer, you'll see that the writer has used, lots of capital letters. Every single line of poetry starts with a capital letter. We've got a lot of very regular punctuation. We've got the commas and the full stop at the end of every fourth line. So there's a full stop, there's a full stop, there's a full stop. So we've got 3 full sentences, and then the fourth sentence culminating in the question mark. And you'll see that the poem has got a very regular rhythm and a regular rhyme scheme. So all of that contributes towards the style of the poet. She says, the morning sun is shining on the green, green willow tree, and sends a golden sunbeam to dance upon my knee. The fountain bubbles merrily, the yellow locusts spring, of life and light and sunshine, the happy brown birds sing. The earth is clothed with beauty, the air is filled with song. The yellow thorn trees load the wind with odors sweet and strong. There is a hand I never touch, and a face I never see. Now what is sunshine? What is song? Now what is light to me? And I hope that you'll see here, and I'm sure this is what you did in class, you'll see that in the first section of the poem, the first 3 sentences, the tone and the feeling and the emotion seems to be light and joyful and happy, and she's describing a beautiful day and the sun is shining and the birds are singing. And then there is this alarming contrast. Suddenly, something's missing, a hand I never see or never touch, and a face, and she's asking all these questions. What does it mean? What does sunshine mean? What does song mean? And you see that rhetorical question very, very strongly placed at the end of that line. So let's have a look at the kind of question they could ask if we were going to write a poetry mini essay on this one. So it's the question we looked at before. The simplicity of the poem hides a deeper meaning. Discuss the statement with close reference to diction, style, and tone. Your response should take the form of a well-constructed essay of 250 to 300 words. So here I've done a little plan for you like we talked about. So the question says, there's a simplicity to the poem, but it's hiding a deeper meaning. So you've got those 2 aspects to discuss in your planning. And they say discuss the statement by referring to diction, style, and tone. So that's why in the planning, I've done a little plan for you on diction and style and tone. All right, so remember, a lot of the diction, if we look at it, the words seem to be very simple. Words that even children would understand. A word like sun or sunbeam, excuse me, or dance. Okay, so I've given specific examples for diction. I've quoted some words that seem to be very simple. It's just a simple description of a really beautiful day. But the question said a deeper meaning is being hidden. So then you'll go to the last 4 lines of the poem and you'll say, but if we look closely at the diction in the last 4 lines of the poem, we suddenly see these ideas like I never touch and I never see. So we know that there is something very important, something very big missing for the writer in this poem. And as we know, if we've studied the poem, we know that very, very sadly, she's talking about the loss of a baby, of a child that did not survive. And so The simplicity is completely contrasted with the much deeper, much more devastating meaning that we know is there. So you've talked about diction. You gave 2 examples. You said one is simple, one is showing a deeper meaning. Now we can move on. So they said talk about diction, style, and tone. So now we look at the style. So if we look at the poem, like we said before, let's just go back and look at the poem. Remember, I said the rhythm was very predictable. The rhyme scheme is very predictable. The morning sun is shining on the green, green willow tree and sends a golden sunbeam to dance upon my knee. It sounds like a children's story, like a nursery rhyme almost, with that very predictable rhyme scheme and the beautiful, very neat little rhyming words. In other words, this is a perfectly created world where there are no challenges. Everything just seems to happen so easily. So the style, the writer has used this childlike, simple, sing-song kind of style for the poem. Very simplistic, very predictable rhyme scheme. But again, the question said, there's a deeper meaning. If we go to the last 4 lines, we suddenly see there is a hand I never touch and a face I never see. Now what is sunshine? What is song? Now what is light to me? So we see that the style makes use of repetition, the repetition of the word what. So these 3 question words, what, and the question mark itself show us in the style that the writer is really asking a very, very serious and deep question, and she would desperately love to know the answer. All right, I don't ask what, unless I've really got something important that I want to ask and that I want to try and understand. And so you see how the style of these last 4 lines helps to create this contrast, this much deeper meaning in the poem. All right, so you see how I keep referring back to my question. And then the question said, also discuss tone. And so here I'm coming to tone. At first, the tone seems to be light, happy, and cheerful. If we look at lines 1 to 12, and you can use some specific examples, you can say, the poet talks about a fountain bubbling merrily, about birds singing, and all of the, the song in the air, and the trees blowing, and the sweet smells. All of these things sound very lovely and delightful. That's enough that you can say about. So the tone is light, cheerful, extremely happy. And then again, if you look at the last 4 lines, suddenly we've got this absolute loss and anguish and lack and distress, which we can see in these words. Let me just find the poem again for you. Such as never, and again never, and the rhetorical question, showing us that something very badly has gone wrong and something extremely important is somehow missing from this perfect world. And that all of this whole beautiful scene means nothing to the writer, and that's your deep underlying meaning. And that's how you construct your poetry mini essay. So I would recommend, even in your planning, that you then divide your page into 4 and put your question in 1 quarter, and then put the 3 poetic devices that they've asked in the other 3 sections of your page, and then you can go and find the examples, put them all together, and produce your essay from that. And it doesn't matter which essay they ask, you can use that method, but plan it and keep going back to the poem. You see, we also did it while we were together here today. We kept going back to the poem to remind ourselves what's in the poem. And as I said with the poem, it's so easy because it's there. All right, now if we look at how they might ask poetic devices in the contextual questions. Again, we often see diction being asked. So let's remind ourselves, diction refers to the specific words that the poet chooses. For example, if we look at the Ingrid Jonker poem, The Child, she actually uses the word child 11 times throughout the poem. And why does she do this? We know from the very beginning that the poem is about the child. The child was, unfortunately, we see in the title, shot dead. So why does she have to keep telling us about the child? In lines 1 and 11, the child is not dead. In lines 2 and 6, the child raises his fists. In lines 16 and 18, the child. In line 19, the child peeps. And in line 20, 21, and 22, the child who, and she talks about, the child is peeping through the window and the child grows up and travels throughout the world. Why? Why has she chosen to use this word so many times? And, even possibly you might think it's unimaginative, it's not creative. We certainly, if we're teaching you to write poetry or to write an essay, we would say to you, that's boring. Why are you starting every sentence in the same way? But of course, the poet is allowed to do that because they're using it for poetic effect. So in this case, the repetition of the word emphasizes. So with poetry, we can often talk about, something that the poet is doing is emphasizing. But you can't just say emphasize. You've got to show what is being emphasized. So here, she's showing us again and again that the victim of the shooting was only a child. So if you really think about what a child is, that's somebody small, somebody vulnerable, innocent. We in our society, and to a large extent, I think it's true, is that your innocence is in your childhood. And that's why it's bad enough. I don't think in any ideal society we want people getting shot. To me, that's very abnormal, very upsetting. But if it's a child, it's so much worse. And that's why she keeps emphasizing it, to make sure that you as the writer understand how terrible this thing is that's happened. And again, when you're answering a question on diction, refer to the specific word. Make sure you've written down the word so that your marker can see which word you're talking about. And then you say why this word is especially meaningful in this context. So if we have a look at another poem, if we looked at the Ella Wheeler Wilcox poem, The Solitude, here she uses emotive words. So her diction is linked to words that show quite a bit of emotion. Laugh, and the world laughs with you. Weep, and you weep alone. For the sad old earth must borrow its mirth, but has trouble enough of its own. So there I've just highlighted some of the words that are used, and then they would say in the question, they would say something like this. In Solitude, the poet uses emotive words effectively to reflect the painful contrasts contained within human relationships. All right. So if we think about the word laugh, it shows us it's very easy to share happiness. We all know that when you're laughing and you're in a good mood, people like to be around you. They like to join in the laughter. And it's easy to be around people when we're happy and when we're in a good mood. But the contrast here is in the word sad and borrow its mirth. Mirth also meaning happiness, but the earth doesn't make its own happiness. It has to find, the happiness. And then there's also the word trouble. And each of these words in the poem is isolated and they're standing alone, just like how we feel sometimes when we are sad and when we are troubled. Very often it's difficult to share that with other people, and it's difficult to find support and people who might understand you when you're feeling like this. And that's really what this poem is all about. So the question might say, and the way that I've worded the question here is exactly like they word the question in the final paper. I've taken the question directly from a final paper and just applied the question to a different poem. By close reference to the diction used, critically discuss the mood. And it's for 3 marks. So you've got to talk about diction, you've got to give a critical discussion, and you must talk about mood. And that's where your 3 marks will come from. And what I want to remind you, please, Matrix, is when you're looking at these 3-mark questions, you have to fight for every single mark. Because if you get 1 out of 3 for every single answer, it means you got nothing wrong. You got a mark. Yay, well done. 1 out of 3 is 33%. It's not enough to even pass the paper, and yet you still got a mark. So you feeling to yourself, oh, I was able to answer it, I said something, I'm doing okay. But you must look at that 3-mark question, because that 3-mark question is a massive challenge, and there's a massive gaping hole between 1 out of 3 and 2 out of 3. So if you manage to get 2 out of 3, now you're doing a lot better. You can take that 33% and you can double it to 66%. Now we're talking, all right? Now you've done really well. And yet, if you're a strong learner and you want your distinction, if you're getting 2 out of 3 every single time you answer a question, it's also not enough. You're never going to reach your distinction if that's what you're doing. So for that 3rd mark, for that 3 out of 3, and that 100%, yes, and I know that those of you that are becoming actuaries are seeing little gaps in my maths. That's why I'm not the maths teacher. Now we're getting 100%. So to get full marks, we've got to make sure that we answer every aspect of the question. So we look at our question, we remind ourselves it's for 3 marks. Refer to diction, refer to mood, critically discuss. So you must tell yourself, this is what I need to do when you're looking at the question. And then you go and you answer the question, and then you say, talk about the mood. A mood of confusion and bewilderment is created. So when I'm reading that poem originally, let's just go back. And I say, laugh and the world laughs with you. Weep and you weep alone. What? Suddenly I'm bewildered. What's happening? 1 minute we're laughing, now we're crying, and then throughout the poem there's these contrasts in emotion all the time. So perhaps when I'm reading the poem, I'm starting to feel like, oh, I'm very confused. I don't know what's happening here. That's fine. Write it down. But now, if you're feeling confused, go and analyze why. Now we can say the reader feels confused because of these contrasting emotions that are mentioned by the writer. The word laugh links to happy and joyful emotions, while the words sad and trouble point to the exact opposite. And remember here, we are now talking about diction because the question said, comment on how the diction creates the mood. So I've talked about laugh and I've talked about sad. So I've told my examiner or my marker, these are the words that I'm talking about, and this is how the words are affecting my understanding. And then for a critical discussion, I can say, for example, the mood is effectively created, leaving the reader uncertain. The writer does this on purpose to make you feel like you're not exactly sure what's going on. So that is, remember we said, critically discuss. Go and find your facts and then tell me, what do you think of all of these facts once they're all put together? That's your critical discussion. If we had to take this exact question and ask it on a poem like Fern Hill, the question might say, by close reference to the diction used, critically discuss the mood that is created in lines 52 to 54. And then they'll give you O as I, and they'll show you the ellipsis like the sea. Grade 12s, remember that this ellipsis shows us that all of the words between the first three and the last three are included in this quote. Take your highlighter, go to the poem, and highlight all of those words. The question is being asked not on these 6 words. No. The question is being asked on these words. Oh, as I was young and easy in the mercy of his means, time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea. That's what we're asking you about. And they say, refer to the diction, critically discuss the mood that is created. So there, I must identify my whole quote. Now I must go and look for words. Let's see what the slideshow says. So, a mood of restlessness and deep emotion is created. So there I can talk about my mood. How did this happen? I must give examples of diction. The word "oh" reflects deep emotion of the writer and points to his desire to be young again. The words dying and chains show that he cannot escape. Old age and death will come to him too. And it comes to all of us. It is inevitable. We are all getting older every day, every moment. And then again, you can say for your critical discussion, the mood is effectively created, reminding the reader of the shortness of youth and the inevitability of death. There are your 3 marks. So for 3 marks, you need to say enough. And don't give up chasing that 3rd mark. Even if you get 4 or 5 3-mark questions on a paper where you're able to get the full mark allocation, it can make a huge difference to your final mark. And many of you grade 12s will be fighting in this paper simply to survive and to get that 40%. And therefore, it's absolutely vital that you fight for that 3rd mark. If you can get that 3rd mark 5 or 6 times throughout the paper, you will be making a huge impact on your final mark, and you will get the mark that you deserve and that you really want to get. If we had to look at the appropriateness or the effectiveness of imagery, that's another question that they love to ask. So remember, we've already talked in this lesson about imagery being, any kind of poetic device that creates a picture or a visual image in your mind. So we're talking metaphor, simile, personification, assonance, alliteration, all that kind of thing. And then they'll ask you to explain why the specific image is suited to a particular poem and in what way. So you must show how the poem and the image suit each other. The same as how if I had, a beautiful pair of high-heeled sandals with all bright, sparkly diamantes, I could show how this pair of sandals suits a beautiful ball gown or a beautiful dress for a matric farewell or a matric dance. The 2 match. You must find that in the poem. So if we looked at the prayer to masks, for example, he talks about, and you too, my lion-headed ancestor, you guard this place that is closed to any feminine laughter, to any mortal smile. And the question will be, refer to lines 4 to 5. So remember, those 3 little dots show me that I'm talking about the whole of line 4 and line 5. So I go and I highlight that for myself. Discuss the appropriateness of this image in the context of the poem. So they've said, talk about appropriate, talk about image, and talk about this poem. Why does this image match this poem? All right, so let's go and have a look at what we could have answered. So then you say to your examiner, the image is appropriate in the context of the poem. So you use those exact words that were in the question, you give them back to your marker, because the poem celebrates traditional African culture and a deep respect for for the role of the ancestors. Okay, so now I've contextualized what the poem is about. So there's that very strong idea that there is this deep respect for the role of the ancestors in the life of the living. Then I go to the image. The image of the lion-headed ancestor creates a strong and traditional picture of a stern and fierce ancestor. The lion head in particular is majestic and powerful. The fact that this place is closed to any mortal smile, the mortal, that's us, the mere humans, tells us that human weakness cannot compare to the power of the ancestors. And remember, the question said, let's look at the question, discuss the appropriateness of the image in the context of the poem. And then I said the image is appropriate. And then I said what the image was about, the deep respect for the role of the ancestors. And then I gave more information about the lion-headed ancestor and how that fits in with the poem as a whole. So for your 3 marks, you've got to do all of that. And this question, the appropriateness of the image, they can ask that about any poem. So if you get this question tomorrow, talk about, then begin with, the image is appropriate in the context of the poem because use those words in your own answer and then say what the poem is about. And remember, appropriate means, do they match each other? Does the image, this traditional lion-headed mask, match this meaning? Yes, it does, because that's a traditional image and it refers to the ancestors and it shows us that the ancestors are strong and powerful and they are not weak as we as humans might tend to be from time to time. Got me? If we look at another question on a different poem, same question. If we looked at the Corin Press poem, This Winter Coming, the quote there is, the seagulls will not land under the sky. This shroud falling, who is not frightened? The question says, refer to lines 6 to 7. So that's my whole quote. The seagulls will not land under the sky. This shroud falling. So you go and you highlight the whole quote. That's what I'm asking you about. And the question again says, discuss the effectiveness of the imagery. Okay, here they didn't say in the context of the poem, but it's implied really because the image is only going to be effective in this poem. I can't take this image and put it somewhere else. It's existing in the poem, so I'm still going to talk about the poem. All right. Now I use, again, exactly the same words that they used in the question, the effectiveness of the imagery, and I say the imagery is effective as the sky is compared to a shroud in this metaphor, and then I show my examiner or my marker that I've identified it as a metaphor. The poet compares the sky to a death shroud or a burial cloth. All right, so remember, traditionally a body is wrapped in a very dark piece of material, a very heavy, very dark piece of material, and that's called a shroud. Okay, and instead of the sky being a source of life-giving sunlight, it brings death and doom, which in turn leads to everyone being scared, frightened, and afraid. So the question was, let's go back, discuss the effectiveness of the imagery. So now I've discussed the effectiveness because I've talked about the sky being compared to a shroud. I've said, usually we think of the sky as a place where we look up to. Even sometimes figuratively, we talk about looking up as being our sense of inspiration. And yet here, it's the other way around. The sky is this deep, dark, threatening color, the same as you would get with the shroud, and all the meaning that comes with that death, disappointment, the end of life, no more possibilities. And Can you see how much you need to say for 3 marks? And I always say to my learners, when you're answering these 3-mark questions, try and remember how we did it in class and how much I talked about, this image or this word or that effectiveness. And you need to put that much in order to get to the 3rd mark. And my own children call it mom-splaining. When I start to explain something to them too many times, they say, don't mom-splain it to me. But in the exam, grade 12, that's exactly what you have to do. You mom-splain the heck out of it, and then you will get to your 3rd mark, which is, after all, what we're after. Let's have a quick look at what we might do in the unseen poem. I love this question because we always get an unseen poem. We always know it's question 5, and we always know that the unseen poem tends to be a little bit fresher, a little bit more interesting maybe than the poems that you studied throughout the year, and they definitely make the questions easier and more accessible because they know we've never seen the poem before. So now they're trying to test, if we learned anything from our study of poetry, can we actually now read a poem and maybe get some meaning out of it, possibly even enjoy the poem. So the questions are definitely easier, but it's quite a tricky skill sometimes to grasp that unseen poem. And again, they give you the poem because they want you to have it, and because they know you need it, and because you can read it as many times as you want. And the more times you read the unseen poem, the clearer and clearer the meaning will become. So please don't waste that poem on the page. Read it again and again, and the meaning will start to come to you more and more clearly. So you read the poem twice, then you read the questions. A good question, a good set of questions will contain some information. Don't answer them, read the poem again, and then answer the questions. So now you've read the poem at least 3 times before you start answering. That is really what I need you to do, grade 12s. Please don't expect to be able to answer it without reading the poem enough times. And for the love of all things holy, grade 12s, don't try and answer without reading the poem at all. Okay, that is just giving insane energy. It's not going to work. Let's have a look at, in the May-June 2020 paper, they gave this poem called African Grass. And you'll see from this poem what I mean about the poems are often very fresh, very light, very easy to kind of relate to. And she says, grass grows here, enough to thatch 1,000 roofs, tall khaki African grass, 2 heads taller than I, laden with beads of dew in the early morning. Shove armfuls aside to pass. Grass caressing my bare thighs, sweeping past me, rustling softly like lovers. Adam and Eve once walked here, naked and innocent in this wild savannah, when the world was young and there was no one else to watch. It's hard to think that this tall crop, coarse in its maturity, burst out of October's black burnt plains, green and succulent and savouring the mellow sun, green to this height. But it's harder yet to think that this crop will crumple to felt fire ashes, fruitless growth. This whispering shall be gone. And because we're running out of time now, I'm not going to read the poem again. And also because we know you're not getting this poem tomorrow. It doesn't really serve any purpose to analyze this poem now. But I do want to show you how we're going to get information from the question. So we've read this poem, and it's about this grass that's growing, and there's some imagery about grass and the sounds of the grass. So you've got an idea when you've read the poem. Then the questions for this poem said, what does the word laden suggest about the dew? So we know the information that we gather is that it's important that there is a lot of dew. So to be laden means, a heavy burden, lots of dew on the grass. So when you read the poem again, you're now aware of the fact that this image is important. So you can even go to your unseen poem and make a note, underline those words that the grass is laden with dew, and draw a little star there for yourself so you know that I must be specifically aware of this. Then the second question said, the grass caressing my bare thighs, sweeping past me, rustling softly like lovers. And the question was, explain what these lines convey about the speaker's attitude towards the grass. So now we know that the speaker has got a particular feeling, a particular attitude towards the grass. And when we go and look at the poem, we can tell ourselves that the grass brushes against the speaker's bare legs, and he or she enjoys the feeling of this bare grass softly brushing their legs. Okay, so now I'm gathering more and more information as I look at my questions. And this is what you're going to do tomorrow in your exam. Then they said at question 5.3, discuss how the length of the lines reinforces the speaker's tone. And if we go back and look at exactly what it looked like in the poem, these were the 3 lines they were referring to. This whispering shall be gone. So you see that the lines become shorter and shorter and shorter. So again, when you're reading the poem for the second or the third time, you're going to look at that and you're going to say to yourself, they're telling me that this is significant. And then you're going to use that information to help you identify what's happening in the poem. And then the last one is where they asked you to refer to stanza 3 and comment on the speaker's observations about the cycle of nature. So if you've read the whole poem and you haven't realized that the speaker is talking about the cycles of nature, you know how a field will have nothing and then suddenly the grass will grow, and then when you look again, the grass is really tall, and then somehow in the winter everything dies down again until there's nothing. That is the cycle of nature. You might not have picked that up the first time you read the poem, and that's fine. Nobody can read a poem once and know absolutely everything that's happening there. But now the question has given you some information that there's a cycle in nature. So you will go back and you will look for that again. So I just wanted to show you how we go about breaking up the unseen poem and making it more accessible to ourselves. And it remains for me, grade 12s, to wish you absolutely all the best for tomorrow's paper. I know it's going to be a fabulous paper. I hope you're going to enjoy it. You're going to get to grips with your Hamlet. You're going to write about your Pi and his wonderful journey across the Pacific Ocean. You're going to read your poems, enjoy them. You're going to fight for that 3rd mark. Use the best language that you possibly can. Your full stops, your capital letters, your paragraphing, your planning for your essays. It's all going to be there. This evening, you're going to spend time reading your summaries for your novel and your play, and then read your summary for your play and your novel. Go over your poems, and tomorrow morning, make sure you eat, even if it's just a little something. Please don't go into that exam and don't eat anything until after 11:30 tomorrow. Your body needs a little bit of a protein or just a little bit of a carbohydrate boost. So a half a piece of toast or just a banana or an apple. Try and get something into your body. It's really good for your brain. When you sit there in the morning and they make you come into the venue so early, just breathe, become calm in yourself. Spend that time while you're filling in your booklet and they're helping you with the sticker, think about Pi or think about Dorian Gray, and just quietly in your mind go over the things that you know about the novel and that you know about your characters. And then when the reading time comes, then you tackle that paper with all the love and energy and everything that you've got to give. And I know, grade 12s, that you're going to succeed. I will be thinking of you every moment from now until 11:30 and beyond, to even when we go and mark the papers. And thank you so much for spending this time with me. I've absolutely loved it. Thank you for watching, and we will definitely see you next time, and good luck for the rest of your exams, not only English. I know you've still got other subjects. We really are thinking of you. Thank you and goodbye.